Hello. My documentary that I watched was about Asian women and their portrayal in popular media. By media, I mean films. What I learned from the documentary, there are a few different stereotypes that I'm going to immediately lay out for you. The first stereotype would be the Dragon Lady stereotype. The Dragon Lady is an Asian woman who is manipulative, she is cunning, and like a lot of the stereotypes, the Dragon Lady is also supposed to be very sensuous and sexual. We see that come up throughout the film, that even in modern day, a different stereotype in modern day, one that started to come into play when Lucy Liu became popular, um, would be the Asian woman who is actually a little bit more dominant than some of the other stereotypes, like the Chinese peasant or like the submissive Japanese woman. Lucy Liu's characterization in her films, she often, a lot of the times she does take on like a little bit more of like an aggressive role, but even then, she's still very, she doesn't have much depth. The characters she plays, they don't have much depth. Even then, she's, still, she's still like just stabbing people. She like has knives. There's not like a whole lot of personality to the characters that Lucy Liu is now stereotyped to play. And even then, those characters who Lucy Liu was playing, those characters were still very sexual and very sensuous, um, appealing to the male gaze, and in a sense, appealing to, I suppose, what the white audience, the white male audience might want. Um, there's also the Chinese peasant stereotype. The Chinese peasant stereotype is talked about a little bit. Throughout the documentary, they actually talk a little bit about different wars that Asian countries, like Korea, the Korean American War, the Vietnam War, about like different wars that different Asian countries were involved in with the United States, and they talk about how that kind of like impacted the way that like people from different Asian countries were portrayed at the time. For example, like there's the whole like submissive Japanese woman stereotype, when the idea in the 1950s, I believe, was that Japanese American women, were thought to be like good cooks because of the way that they were portrayed in the film, like good cooks, submissive, just the type who I suppose would make for like an ideal wife, the type who would give in to what her husband, her white husband, wanted. Um, and they also talk about the Chinese peasant stereotype, where in the Chinese woman, and this also would have been an older film, before the 1960s, and I believe before the 1950s as well, where the Chinese woman is portrayed as like a peasant. She's very poor. Um, she's also fairly submissive. The Chinese peasant, from what I remember, wasn't necessarily portrayed as being like a very like attractive like woman, but it is like a stereotype that does come up in the film. They also talk a little bit about like modern day like Lucy Liu. They talk about modern day stereotypes of Asian women, like Lucy Liu, for example. Lucy Liu is a little bit more dominant than, say, the submissive Japanese woman or the Chinese peasant. Lucy Liu in her films, like, she sometimes has like knives, she has like weapons, and she comes off like she's a little bit more in control. However, in the film, they still talk about the fact that this is still not actually a positive portrayal of Asian women. Um, and the Lucy Liu characters that she tends to portray in her films, or that she has tended to portray in her films in the past, are still women who are portrayed as being, very like very sexual and very sensuous. Something interesting that kind of like ties all of the stereotypes that are talked about in the film together is just the fact that, like, perhaps with the exception of the Chinese peasant stereotype, the majority of the time in film since like the 1920s into modern day, and I suppose it's mentioned that it's gotten a little bit better in modern day as we've started to have some more Asian filmmakers, but even then, at the end of the documentary, they talk a little bit about how the dragon lady stereotype, the whole submissive, the sexual stereotypes, still play a heavy role in the way that Asian women are viewed today, and are still a part of films today. That hasn't gone away. But just in general, like, it seems like there's very much like a sexualization of like Asian women. And what I found interesting in the documentary as well is that they talk a little bit about how the portrayal of Asian women. We talk a little bit about how the media portrayal actually impacts Asian women in real life. Like, get interviews from like an Asian female news anchor, and we get interviews as well from like Asian students who like attend like UC Berkeley, and they talk about just the experiences with like white American men. They're just expecting them, you know, to be like good in bed, for example. Um, the um, the white American men. There's one woman in the film when she mentions that a white American man had initially thought that she was Italian, and then when he found out that she was Asian, or that she was Japanese, I think to be more specific, um, he immediately assumed that she was good at certain types of like sexual activities. And in the documentary, we actually also see white American men interviewed who talk about, you know, wanting an Asian woman specifically, and it sounds like part of that desire for them like ties into the way that they've seen Asian women like stereotyped to be in film and in different forms of media that we tend to consume every day. Um, it's very interesting because we also get a little bit in the documentary about like how Asian men and Black men are portrayed. I thought that the mention of how Black men are portrayed in the film, I thought that that was really interesting because I, of course, like heard before that Black men are portrayed as being like very, you know, like masculine and dominant and aggressive, like in our forms of media nowadays. And they talk a little bit about how like some like rappers, some like hip hop artists like portray Asian women, you know, in their videos, and they talk about how just in a general sense, like there's just kind of like an objectification of women in the videos. Um, they also talk about white American men. They drop a statistic in for us. One of them does. I think that it was an Asian male, I want to say director, filmmaker, who drops a statistic in for us about how 15% of Japanese women are actually married to white American men. And the man in the film, he questions, you know, like how much of that has to do with the way that Asian men are portrayed in film, as perhaps not being, you know, like strong romantic interest from the Asian women. That's what he talks about a little bit. And it's interesting because we also, even going back to the days where in interracial relationships, like, for example, like we hear about how there was like, it was discouraged for there to be like I don't know how to pronounce this word, but it was discouraged basically for them to actually show like an Asian woman like kissing a white man on screen, like in the during the time of like the Hays Code, and so they instead what they would do is they would hire like white female actresses, and they would have like the white female actresses, um, they would have the white female actresses play like Asian women, um, which is very offensive, of course. And then there was a film that Marlon Brando starred in I think the 1950s, with a woman who I believe is supposed to be Japanese, that portrays like, you know, like interracial relationships. I don't want to say necessarily in a positive light because the Japanese woman in the film is she's still very submissive, you know? Um, in comparison to like the way that some like white American women are portrayed in the film, like we see that the Asian women aren't really portrayed as having personalities. They're supposed to be a lot of the time, and once again, it varies depending upon like era, like the stereotypes. Um, it can vary, but we see that a lot of the time, like Asian women in film have been portrayed as just being like very docile, you know, not having like minds of their own. Um, and what I also thought was interesting is that in the documentary, we actually do see like an Asian woman who I think is a student. She talks a little bit about how she felt like being married to like a white American man or dating a white American man gave her a little bit more I don't the right word isn't power, it gave her a little bit more, I suppose, like social status quo, if that makes sense, or social uplifted her socially. I'm trying to think of the right way to say it. As opposed to like being with an Asian man like in America. And it's kind of interesting because they talk a little bit about how a lot of Asian women also are like portrayed as being with white men, and how white men, they talk about the image of like white men in the media, how like a lot of white men are portrayed, you know, as being like, you know, like the heroes, like the Clint Eastwood types, uplifted, and that's probably partly why there are a fair amount of like romantic relationships in real life between white men and Asian women, because what we see in the media a lot of the times has more of like an impact on our mind and our perception of reality than we may expect. Yeah, thank you for listening to my video. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you. Bye.